Thank you very much to the Mind Science Foundation and Mariam also to invite me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. So I'll be talking in the next few minutes about disorders of consciousness indeed, and the ways we try to quantify consciousness, in patients that cannot, communicate that to you, and the importance of understanding consciousness both scientifically and clinically to do this. So the first part of my talk is really to re-emphasize how consciousness and responsiveness are two different things. Typically in the clinic, we assess consciousness by a response to command at the bedside. And it's true that most of the time these two properties go together. If you're conscious, you're able to respond. But in many cases, this equation is problematic. For example, in patients in the vegetative state, these are patients who, they have the eyes open, but they show no sign of responsiveness, no sign of consciousness at the bedside that you can see. However, they have some behaviors. They can open the eyes and move, sometimes have some reflexive, emotional, expressions on their face, and these cases are very problematic. Also for families, it's a very fundamental, important problem to understand if there is anybody behind the stare. And this was, for example, illustrated by the case of Schiavo, where there was a lot of debate, was this patient conscious or not? And in most of the cases, clinicians consider these patients unconscious and they take it for granted because there is no response that you can see at the bedside. However, we know now that this is not the case. There are many patients that are in vegetative state, and we have all the reasons to think that they are there. One of the first experiments we did with Adrian Owen was actually to design a paradigm using functional MRI where you can detect response to command by reading the brain. So if you ask someone to imagine playing tennis in the scanner, in each and every person, you will see actually the motor cortex light up when you ask them to imagine playing tennis, and not when you ask them anything else like resting, Only by reading the brain, you can see when you ask them for 30 seconds to imagine playing tennis, you see the motor cortex activate. And if you do another task, like imagine walking around your home, actually you'll activate some other areas in the brain. And you can see very, very specifically, you can play a game and just guess when they are doing what. It's really very clear. So with this tool, we went to patients in vegetative state, and we tried to see if any of these patients were showing responses. And to our surprise, actually many patients have this show signs of consciousness of response to command in the functional MRI. So you see a patient that is completely, like Schiavo, completely unresponsive at the bedside, even for years, And then you ask them to imagine different things in the functional MRI, and they'll do it for you. They can show, they can communicate their consciousness this way. We went further, actually, to try to actually communicate by yes and no using these paradigms with some patients. And this is a patient, for example, I'm not sure the pointer is working, but a patient that where we could ask him questions, and we said to him, if you want to say yes, imagine playing tennis. If you want to say no, imagine navigating, around your home. And the patient appropriately answered several questions, like, is your father's name Alexander? He could say yes. Is your father's name Thomas? He could say no. Do you have any brothers? Yes. Do you have any sister? No. And that was accurate each time. So we could, potentially use such tools to communicate with patients in the vegetative state. And this is very important because we've done some other studies with Stephen Norris investigating quality of life in patients with locked-in syndrome, where they have minimal responses like looking up and down, but you can communicate with them. And we saw that many patients in a chronic locked-in syndrome, actually a majority of them, have actually a subjective good quality of life only if they can communicate. So this is crucial for these patients, that we can actually help them detect consciousness and try to communicate with them. The problem is, this is certainly a great advance, but consciousness and responsiveness are not the same thing. There could be some patients that say, are aphasic or don't want to do it, or they fall asleep, or, at just that particular time you were doing. Maybe they just don't want to collaborate with you. They won't respond, but they are definitely there. We need to go beyond these responsiveness-based paradigms. We need to really understand what are the links between consciousness and the brain and try to detect consciousness itself and not a proxy like that. And, there are many different situations that we can actually investigate and take advantage of to really try to detect some markers of consciousness itself and not a response to command like this. And one of the situations Christoph talked about is, of course, during dreams during sleep. In these situations, we're completely unresponsive. If you would ask me, imagine playing tennis, I would not do it for sure, but we definitely have an experience. Consciousness, defined as subjective experience, is definitely present. And all you need, you don't need an environment, you need the brain, being in a certain state to be able to specify it. And so we are investigating more and more these unresponsive states so that we can really look at the markers of experience of consciousness itself, dissociated from behavior. And so we've done now many experiments in the lab in Madison with Giulio Tononi on sleep and trying to wake up people repetitively during the night and ask them, were you having an experience, were you there or unconscious, and what type of dreams did you have? And actually what we saw is doing this is actually we dream much more often than we think. When you wake up people during the night, they actually report dreams 2/3 of the time. And not only during REM sleep, like the paradoxical sleep, where your brain is more activated, but also during non-REM sleep and even during deep sleep. You would have conscious experiences actually 2/3 of the time. So here we say no conscious experience was unconsciousness, a minority of the cases. Conscious experience with a recall, they were able to report their dream. And then conscious experience without recall, they were sure they were dreaming, but they don't remember of what. You can see that 2/3 of the time, subjects were conscious during sleep, while they were completely unresponsive. And interestingly, even during REM sleep, in a minority of the cases here in blue, you can have also some report of unconsciousness that they were not there. So in these two conditions, both during non-REM sleep, slow wave sleep, and then paradoxical sleep, we can contrast brain activity during states where subjects are unconscious versus conscious and see what is really making the difference in the brain, independently of behavior. So we've done that now in 3 different groups of subjects, and we're continuing to acquire more data about this. But what you can see, actually, when you really control for these confounds, for the behavioral confounds, is that unlike the current dogma, in many consciousness, views of consciousness, the frontal cortex doesn't seem to be involved in what is making a difference between consciousness and unconsciousness. What you see light up is what Christoph was mentioning, is a posterior hot zone in the back of the brain. And it's like medial and lateral areas in the parietal, occipital, temporal lobes. And these are the areas that make a key difference. They have actually much more slow waves when you're unconscious. And they're much more depolarized and functioning when you are dreaming, when you're having an experience during sleep. And this is true not only during non-REM sleep, but also during REM sleep. We see the same exact areas light up. And we confirm that also, we're continuing to confirm that in other states like seizures and anesthesia, these zone really, when you control for confounds, really light up every time. And so we wanted to kind of push further and see, all right, we see this difference, but can we really predict online, guess once someone is dreaming or not during sleep, using the signal in this part of the brain? So that's what we did here. We had subjects sleeping, and then we took the signal from a few electrodes, just a few electrodes in the back of the brain. And then we looked, within subject to the extremes of the slow wave power and the fast frequencies, and we looked really at the best marker for arousal, so the fast compared to the slow frequency in that area. So we get the ratio of this, which is the marker of local sleep in the back. And then from this, we predicted that if you're in the extreme of this ratio and your posterior cortex is really awake, so very low slow wave and very high frequencies, then you'll be conscious. And then if you are in the other extreme, when you have a lot of local sleep marker in the back, then you would be conscious. And this worked really well. Just from this posterior horizon signaling a few electrons in the back of the brain, we were actually able to be right 85% of the time for a chance level of 50%. And here you can see the chance level is here, and we were able to guess at the single trial level, like online, if the subjects were conscious or not during sleep, using the back of the brain. And here you can see like it's a post-hoc analysis, which areas were the most predictive, and again, the posterior horizon lights up. Not only we can predict if you're conscious or not during sleep, but we can also look at the contents of the dreams. We can contrast, different kind of contents. For example, if you were dreaming of a face, then we can actually predict that you have more activity in the fusiform face area within sleep. This is source reconstruction of high-density EEG. You can see when you were dreaming of faces, you have actually the fusiform face area, which is known to be involved in faces also during wakefulness, light up. And we can also predict some other contents, like, for example, spatial contents, the experience taking place indoor or outdoors. There you can see some difference in the right spatial, right posterior cortex, or parietal cortex, again in the back. And from that posterior horizon, at other times, we can predict if you were dreaming of moving or not. And there you can find some area close to the area MT, which is known to be like visual motion area. Or some other contents like speech. Again, you can see that some posterior area make the difference to the contents of dreams. If you were speaking in your dreams, then you have an area close to Wernicke that is also light up. So this shows you that from the posterior cortex activity, we can predict both the level and the contents of consciousness during sleep, while the frontal cortex doesn't seem to make a lot of difference here. And then we recently reviewed, what was the available evidence from other sources. There are actually some very, very informative cases from a while back, very well described classical neurology cases, showing that you can have the whole prefrontal cortex removed by surgery for epilepsy, and the patient is definitely conscious. This is a patient described by Brickner, in 1952, who had prefrontal cortex removed on both sides, and you can see here the parts of the brain that were removed on top. And this patient was definitely behaving surprisingly like normally, definitely conscious. Like there is a report of this patient after surgery, after bilateral frontal lobe resection, where he toured the Neurological Institute in New York in a party of 5, and 2 of them were distinguished neurologists, and nobody noticed anything for more than an hour. And if anything, the patient was much more, emotionally touched by the death of some friends, or definitely the patient was there. There's no doubt about that. And this tells you a lot from these lesion cases that the frontal cortex doesn't seem to be necessary for consciousness. It's a big contrast with the back. If you lesion some posterior parts of the brain, for example, a posterior callosum, or some large, anoxic injury in the back of the brain, you will have much higher chances to stay in the vegetative state permanently. Like here, this is a report of traumatic brain injury, large lesion of the posterior callosum. You have a 250 times higher chance to never recover from that. And same for anoxic injury. The cases I described here, they never recovered. So there's a big contrast. While the front doesn't seem to be necessary, if you lesion some large parts of the posterior cortex, the patient never recovered from that. So that's evidence from lesions, but also there is some evidence from direct electrical stimulation. If you go and perturb, like they do for mapping, for epilepsy surgery, they do some mapping, electrical stimulation of different parts of the brain. If you stimulate different parts of the posterior brain, you will have actually a lot of different contents that are actually emerging within consciousness. As Christoph mentioned, you can have some stimulation of the parietal cortex, leading to some like intention to move, a conscious experience of intention. In some other cases, you stimulate the fusiform face area I was talking about, and then you see some change in how you experience faces. And also in some very posterior part, like mid-cingulate here, posterior part of the frontal lobe, you can also have some thought-like contents that are emerging within consciousness. But in most of the frontal lobe, you can stimulate, there will be no change in experience at all. The frontal cortex is mostly silent for consciousness. And also, using neuroimaging, there's more and more progress now on how people approach scientific questions about consciousness and better control for confounds. And we can actually see that when you dissociate consciousness from response and from behavior, again, the frontal cortex doesn't seem to correlate at all with experience itself. You can do that differently. You can look, as I was saying, within unresponsive state like sleep or anesthesia. You can contrast unresponsive state where consciousness is present versus absent, and the posterior whole zone light up. You can better control for behavior even within patients with brain damage, control, like comparing minimally conscious state to vegetative state. Again, the difference will be in the back. In contrast to if you just look at wakefulness versus sleep, or like wakefulness, normal subjects to patients that are really severely unresponsive, then you'll see everything, kind of the frontal cortex and the back as well. But if you control properly, the posterior horizon lights up in these cases. And in healthy volunteers, there's the same kind of revolution, I would say, going on, because now the experimenters are actually realizing how it is important to control for confounds. Just the fact of giving a report, like we usually, probe subjects for their experience by pressing a yes or no button, just the fact of being involved in a task or giving a report for your experience will actually change a lot of other processes in the brain than just the experience itself. And so if you do that, if you use report paradigms or task-relevant stimuli, you'll see both the front and the back light up. But if you control for that, if you use, for example, no task paradigms, some proxies like pupil size, that you validated independently as being predictive for conscious experience, if you use these no task paradigms, or if you look at experience versus modulation by task, you will see again that the neurocortex of the different contents of consciousness are in the back. And so both the within state paradigms, looking really at situations where other confounds are controlled, being responsiveness or physiology, like the differences in neuromodulation between sleep and wake, and targeting the differences in experience itself. And in awake volunteers, controlling for other things that are other processes than experience, being task-related or reports. If you do these kind of controls more carefully, you will see that actually the posterior hot zone seems to be the seat where both the level and the contents of consciousness are mostly specified. And that's what Christoph was mentioning earlier, like the importance of distinguishing conceptually the difference between background conditions and the substrate of consciousness itself, like in mechanisms, right? So for example, you could have some global enabling factors, like blood flow or oxygen. They are necessary for your brain to function, but these are not really, like everybody would agree, they are not really involved in experience itself. But within the brain, there are many other processes, like the brainstem activating the whole cortex. And then also the eye and the ports in, like really the inputs and the outputs, also like the report, all these different processes, these loops, are all around the substrate of consciousness, and consciousness interacts with them. But these are not the same thing, and we need to carefully think and control for them. And that's really, I think, a great progress that has been made in the science of consciousness over the last 10 years, is that we are really conceptually more careful and controlling better the experiments, and we're making great progress in understanding how brain and mind are related that way. So it's great we're making progress, and we start to better understand the role of the front versus the back, or different types of neural processes that are involved in consciousness. But if you really want, also ethically, to be the most specific and the more precise on detecting consciousness within a human brain, your best, bet, your best approach is actually to try to understand really how consciousness works. From first principle, define consciousness, what it is, and we define it as subjective experience, what disappears during dreamless sleep, find its properties, and from consciousness then go into predictions about what kind of substrate, what kind of physical, system could actually specify it. And so that's what integrated information theory is trying to do, and that's what Julia will talk about. I won't talk about it now. I'll just show you how actually we can go from this theoretical approach to some predictions we can test that are both scientifically relevant and clinically useful. And so integrated information theory predicts that for a system to be conscious, it has to be both integrated and differentiated. All the different parts have to communicate together, but then the different parts of the system have to specify different kind of information as well. And these two properties are two examples of what we can already try to translate into experiments and make some predictions about brain activity patterns that are associated or not to consciousness. Not only this, but you also have to think carefully about how to approach it. So we know that consciousness can be entirely generated within the brain, and we know that inputs and outputs to the brain are actually confounds, and we want to avoid that. So what you really would like is assess within the brain that differentiation and integration, being as specific as you can to measure that. And so that's the idea behind the use of transcranial magnetic stimulation to directly perturb the brain and then measure what the connectivity looks like, how complex the patterns are within the brain, right? And so the idea is that you bypass inputs and outputs, you directly go and stimulate the brain, and you investigate the kind of patterns you have, the complexity of the connectivity patterns using this tool. So the transcranial magnetic stimulation is that coil here, and we stimulate the brain directly, and then we record brain activity using neuronavigation to target different parts of the cortex. And as I was saying to you, we're guiding our prediction using integrated information theory. And integrated information theory predicts that for a system to be conscious, you need both integration and differentiation. And actually, you can model that if the system is integrated and differentiated, there will be a very different response pattern to TMS than if one of these two properties are missing. For example, if you had no integration, no connectivity, the response to TMS would be very local and stay basically under where you stimulate, not propagate. But if you lose differentiation, you will have a big response, but everybody will do the same. You will have a very big stereotype slow wave. Only if you have integration and differentiation, you will have a complex pattern where the response propagates, but also all the different parts of the brain will have a different response shape. And so from this prediction, then we can actually go to experiments and test if that's the case. And so Marcello Massimini and Giulio Tononi have done that for the last 10 years now. And I've had basically starting from experiments during sleep, comparing wakefulness to sleep, where non-REM sleep where subjects were unconscious. And you can see basically that this prediction seems to hold. Above you see wakefulness, and across is where you stimulate with the TMS, And you can see these different colors is where the brain activity resonates at different times. You can see that the signal moves around in the brain. And if you look at what the different brain areas do, like all these different traces are the signal from different parts of the brain, you can see that actually all the different brain areas are doing something different. The response propagates, it's long-lasting, and it's differentiated. And then the subjects report they were there. But if the subjects are unconscious during non-REM sleep, you can have two different kind of patterns depending on how hard you stimulate. Most of the time, the response will stay very local. It will not propagate. It will stay just under where you stimulate. There is a loss of integration. And in some cases, if the stimulation is strong enough, you can have some propagation in the brain. But all the different brain areas will do the same thing. There's a loss of differentiation. So either loss of integration or loss of differentiation are there. And that's what I was saying to you, kind of confirming the predictions that For consciousness to be present, you need both integration and differentiation. If you're unconscious, there will be a loss of integration or a loss of differentiation. And now the situation is very different if you do that during REM sleep when subjects are dreaming. You can see that again you have that same response pattern than in wakefulness where the signal propagates, it's long-lasting, it's differentiated. Both integration and differentiation are there. And we've done some experiments under anesthesia confirming that. Basically, same story. If the subjects are conscious, you will have a very complex response. But under midazolam, propofol, xenon, each time the subjects are unconscious with different drugs, very different mechanisms, you have loss of integration or loss of differentiation. Here, for example, in propofol or midazolam, the activity stays very local. In xenon, you have a bigger response, but everybody's doing the same job. There's a loss of differentiation. And then we did an interesting experiment under ketamine, where actually subjects were completely unresponsive. But after that, they were actually reporting very vivid dreams. One was Frodo on the Mount Doom. Another one was seeing his family in boxes flying around the sky. Like behaviorally, they were completely unresponsive. But we could see online the response was complex. And then they wake up and they tell us, I was there, definitely. It was just strange, but I was definitely experiencing something. So across conditions where we could validate using a report, that the subject were conscious or unconscious, basically TMS EEG is doing a wonderful job. Showing that each time you're conscious, the response is very complex, integrated, differentiated. Each time a subject is unconscious, it's very stereotyped, either a local or a big slow wave, but very simple, very stereotyped. So we try to push that further now and try to convert these properties into one number we could use as a clinical tool, like a consciousness meter, to detect consciousness at the bedside. And so what Marcello Massimini designed is an index called perturbational complexity index. And basically, it's trying to zip the response like you would zip a file. With algorithmic complexity, try to see how simple that is, and get a number out of that. And so basically what you do is you get the significant response to the TMS across time, and you summarize that into a binary matrix. Basically, there is a response, there is no response. It's 1, 0, 1, and you can have the response in space and time, like a summary of all that activity triggered by TMS, deterministic activity, like causal connectivity, assessed by TMS. And you can zip that, and then basically you get one number out of it that tells you how easy it is to summarize how complex the response is. And actually, that PCI index is doing, like in the first trials, was really trying to capture what we wanted to capture, because if the response is very local, PCI will be very low. But also if you have a large response but very stereotyped, like a big slow wave, then it will also be very low. Only if the response is integrated and differentiated, complex, PCI will be high. So with these, we did a set of experiments where we tried to really validate the index in the conditions where we had reports, like I was showing to you all these conditions during sleep, anesthesia. And once we know that this index is actually capturing very well if there is an experience, if someone is there or not, basically, then we can go to some patients that cannot communicate and try to infer, try to, see what we get. And stratify them. And so these are like the validation data here. The experiments I was talking about, like sleep, and then 3 different kind of anesthetics, like all the situations where patients were unconscious. PCI was always very low. But then in all the different other conditions, like REM sleep, ketamine, normal wakefulness in healthy volunteers, but also importantly, locked-in syndrome patient with strokes, brain damage patients that were also conscious, the PCI was also very high there. And EMCS is the patients that recover from vegetative state and are able to communicate again. So in these cases, we know the subject may be brain damaged, but are definitely conscious. PCI is always high there. To the point that we could draw a line, like empirically, and find a cutoff. It's like 0.31, but with that value, you're right 100% of the time. And as David was mentioning, I'm doing since 15 years some work of that type. It was the first time we could really get an accuracy level like that. And so then with this tool, we went to patients with disorders of consciousness, minimally conscious state, vegetative state, to try to stratify them. Patients in minimally conscious state, they show some sign of consciousness on the bedside, some responsiveness. It's just they cannot communicate, but they're there. But they are very close to vegetative state patients behaviorally. PCI was able to detect consciousness in these patients in 95% of the cases, and the 2 cases where actually it didn't work, Marshall was saying they were kind of dozing off. So, but it does a very good job of detecting consciousness in these patients. And then in patients in vegetative state, what we found is basically 3 types of responses. The majority of patients with vegetative state had a PCI very low. And you could have either no response at all, or in majority of them, it was actually more like a sleep-like response. But then, in about 20% of the patients in vegetative state, you find a PCI index that is in the value of normal consciousness. And so from our best scientific guess, these patients are definitely there. Confirming also the findings we had with Imagine playing tennis, different sources of evidence really point that a significant number of patients in vegetative state are actually conscious, even if we can't detect it. And that's important, as I was saying to you, ethically, because then it's your ethical duty to try to communicate with them. And these patients are many. It's estimated in the US like 40,000, maybe, and then worldwide, several hundred of thousand people in the chronic vegetative state that are locked, and you need to detect them and try to communicate with them. But then also within the patients that are most likely unconscious from our best scientific bet, with PCI very low, it makes a difference if the patient has no response at all. You might think that actually the neurons are not really functioning anymore, and maybe that can carry some information for prognosis. The patients that have sleep-like responses, in contrast, you might want to try to act on the background conditions, what Christoph was saying, maybe some neuromodulation in the subcortical system to try to bring the person back and treat them. And so it gives a lot of useful clinical information to try to detect the patients with who to communicate or the target therapeutic interventions. So what I'll try to show you is that consciousness is often present during unresponsive states, unlike what most clinicians kind of assume. Responsiveness is really a biased and limited way to assess if someone is there. It is useful, no doubt, but it has serious caveats. And also during sleep anesthesia, we find that. But 20% of patients in the vegetative state, about this range, are definitely conscious, and we need to know that and to do something about that. So this is both important, both ethically and scientifically, to know that. It's also important scientifically because if you control for responsiveness and you look at the neural correlates of consciousness itself, then you find very different results than what was done before, and you can see that the frontal cortex is actually mostly involved in responsiveness, and the neural correlates of both the level and the content of consciousness itself seems to be largely specified by a posterior hot zone in the back of the brain. And then finally, I try to show you that predictions coming from first principle, from a theory that tried to start from consciousness, define its property, and then go from there to some predictions about its physical substrate. Such kind of theoretical approach can actually be very useful not only scientifically but clinically. And it has already been used, to design some approaches like TMS and EEG. You can call it zap and zip, like you zap the brain and then you zip to see how complex that is. But you can really use this information to develop some consciousness meters, like the PCI index, that can bring you a lot of diagnostic, but also potentially therapeutic information for patients with disorders of consciousness. And I want to thank a lot of people there, especially Giulio Tononi, Marcello Massimini, and Stephen Norris. And thank you so much for having me.